Our next event features a power-packed triad conversation. Please welcome the four doctors, Dr. Nestor-Baker, Dr. Schlechty, Dr. J. Daniel Good, our superintendent, facilitated by Dr. Scott Ebbrecht.
Thank you very much. So each of you have helped to craft and implement educational policy at the local, state, and or national level. And each of you have been a mentor to many. We appreciate you being here to chit-chat a little bit about challenges, changes, and choice in public education. Dr. Schlechty, we just heard you speak about the Common Core. And many people think that the Common Core is a lifesaver to us here in the United States. In other words, it's an opportunity to prepare our students to be 21st century educators. However, some people are saying, wait, just a minute here. I think we're getting ahead of ourselves, and it's actually, we may be stifling creativity by implementing the Common Core. I think you got some pretty strong thoughts, so can you share those with us?
Yeah. Well, first off, I'm one of those that said wait. And the reason I say wait is not because I'm opposed to curriculum standards. I think it's reasonable for a school district or a state, and perhaps even the nation, I'm not sure about the nation, to state these are the things we want kids to be taught. But when it comes down to performance standards and standardizing performance standards is where you get into the destruction of creativity. So we need to ask ourselves, what are we standardizing here? And we can say, we expect, for example, would anyone argue that every child ought to be able to read well enough to be able to pick up Newsweek magazine and read it with some understanding? I think that's a reasonable standard. And so why not state that publicly? I mean, we really want to do that. And then let's find out how do we go about doing it. But what we'll find out is we're not very good at it with a lot of kids. We're simply not getting a lot of kids to do what we say we'd like them to do. So then we had to go back and look at how are we going about teaching this stuff? Because the fact of the matter is we're blaming teachers for realities that they're confronting that they never before had to confront. You know, I went to school and graduated from high school with kids who were, in today's standard, would be called functionally illiterate. I mean, I went back to my 50th, and it's been years ago, I went back to my 50th high school graduation reunion. And I looked at the pictures on the wall, and I could identify 4 kids that I know could not pass a test of functional literacy, but they graduated from school. I'm absolutely sure one was, because I almost married her. So,
and the other one became a CEO.
Well, that's almost true, by the way. But the thing we have to understand is that the standards have changed. And we now expect all kids to be able to read with understanding. You have to, you know, we used to have newspaper editors who kind of, if you knew what their bias was, you know, if you lived in Columbus, you understood, you picked up a Columbus Dispatch, you were going to get a Republican version of reality. So you just simply read it that way and understood it that way and dealt with it that way. Or if you went to Dayton and got a hold of the Herald, I think it was, you're going to get a Democrat version of reality. But so you knew
it's like CNN and Fox, right?
Right. CNBC. Yeah. But we have to ask ourselves, how do we get people so that they can be their own editor? Because no longer, I mean, when kids are reading on the web, they don't have any way to get it siphoned out for them, any way to get it teased. So they've got to become much more well-educated in order to fulfill their citizenship function. There's a time when you could fulfill your citizenship function by learning who to pick out to find out what you thought. But now you can't do that because you don't know who the people are and the thought producers are there. And the last thing I want to say about this, now I'll shut up and let other people talk. But you saw what happened in Atlanta with the testing thing. Now, we've done a lot of work with Atlanta, and we know a lot of those principles. I don't think we have any of them that we worked with that are going to go to jail. But they told us a long time before it happened, somebody's going to go to jail down here because they were under so much pressure to get the test scores up that they eventually, you know, if you have that kind of pressure, it's going to corrupt the system. And they're not alone. I mean, in some states, I don't know what you've done in Ohio, but in some states, they've routinized cheating. It's called test prep. You know, when I went to school, if you had crammed for a test, your teacher would have told you were doing something bad. Now we set aside time in school for kids to cram. When test time comes, we have cram time. We've now legitimized it and call it test prep. But basically, the test becomes a thing rather than education becoming the thing. And so I worry that we're going to create a system in which we'll destroy the quality of life in schools in the effort to gain test scores. And there's a lot of difference between test-based standards and standards-based standards.
Any thoughts on that?
Yes, there's a lot that I have to think about. You are echoing what I think in my own head oftentimes and don't get the chance to air in front of everybody. But the idea
They're not out there.
They're not out there. No, this is
here.
just us. That's right. The idea that we are putting so much pressure on educators, so much pressure on the system, and yet we're not providing any release valve to deal with that pressure. And what we have then, we have the children that you're talking about who years ago graduated as illiterates. We have all of the children coming in with massive issues, social issues that we've not had to deal with before, and yet the resources to help educators deal with them aren't there. And at the same time, we're asking that we crank up all of the issues around standards, that we ladle on all of the extra requirements around testing and so forth, and then we say, and don't forget to be creative. And it's not working. We've got a disconnect there. And until we can deal with that disconnect, we're not going to make the progress we all know we can do.
That's right.
It's interesting in that the driver behind the Common Core curricula was to also address the remediation rates in college, and yet we can't agree on what a remediation rate threshold is in the university still. And this isn't a new phenomenon. In fact, back in 1889, when there were only 450 colleges in the United States, 389 of them claimed that students weren't well enough prepared and that they had to add remedial classes in both reading and numeracy. And so this isn't...
Only 4% of the kids are graduating high school.
Only 3% of the kids, the top 3%, were accepted into those universities at that time, and yet we still had that remediation issue. The concern I have, in addition to that with the Common Core, is that it only addresses two of the languages in how we express our hearts, and that's in numeracy and in linguistics. But there are also ways we do that visually, in 2- and 3-dimensional art, in static and dynamic performance, in movement, in music, both instrumental and vocal. And we don't have standards for that, and we don't seem to value those multiple perspectives for how students experience the world, and then how they interpret that and make meaningful their lives. And if the Common Core would address those other ways of students expressing their hearts, I might be more receptive to having some benchmarks or thresholds or standards for performance in those.
I still would argue that if you have performance standards for art, you'll destroy art. You know, I used to facetiously say to some of my students, I know how to solve the sex problem in adolescence. Introduce a sex appreciation course. Look what we've done to art and music. I mean, you can destroy it. I mean, and we got to be very careful that we don't destroy the very thing we're trying to create interest in.
I never knew that you incorporated health standards there too. Okay. So,
but I also think, Scott, that we need to allow students to be able to find their voice and find the way that they express, and when they perform in that particular means, then, and we wouldn't have to have a standard there necessarily.
All you have to do is walk down your hall.
That's right. That's right.
You're really onto something. This is hugely important. I think one of my greatest fears is that we are stripping the voice away from students. Where, you know, the video talked about the cookie cutter factory mentality and the model of education. And while on the one hand you hear all these pundits talking about that's what we're doing away with, in actuality we're cementing it. We're making it much more rigid. Yeah. And we're stripping the voice from our very children, that we need to have that creativity, that we need to understand the arts and explore it and bloom with it and not be boxed by it.
Well, the state assessments are coming where we're going to be, park assessments,
yes,
where we're going to be sitting students down at a computer, theoretically, and they're each going to be having to take this test. And how do we assess, though, for music, PE, and also how do we assess teachers that are teaching those courses? Any thoughts on that?
It's an interesting question. Connecticut's been doing online assessments in music appreciation, performance, expression for at least 15 years. And when I worked at the State Department, that was a model that we looked at. Do I know that it's effective, and do I agree that there ought to be, again, a benchmark of performance? Not necessarily, but I do think there are ways to assess whether a student has begun to assimilate some of those new learnings, and they do exist online. But I don't know that online is the end all, the panacea, the silver bullet for determining. It's that application that Dr. Schlechty talked about.
I don't think the problem is with having the test and
No.
using the test. It's what it's used for.
Yeah.
And I think what we do is, instead of using it for diagnostic purposes, we use it for judgmental purposes and for ranking kids and for placing kids and for ranking schools and as opposed to saying, what can these tests do for us? You know, if I go to my doctor and he finds out my blood pressure is high, he doesn't say, you failed your blood pressure test. You know, I mean, he said, here's a configuration of things that are going on, and we need to look at that. Part of it, you know, you're just too fat. You know, if you want to get better about your blood pressure, one thing you got to do to get over being fat. And then I said, well, I got on the scales every day. He said, that's not going to do it. You don't get enough exercise.
You just keep taking us back to health.
That's right.
All goes back to being healthy. Okay? Well, you know, when you think about the Common Core, one of the things also, one of the big topics right now is public funding and how we're going to fund education. And both, you know, things are changing both locally and nationally. And, you know, how do these models affect public education? And how will these affect stakeholders, not only teachers, kids, but also communities? So any thoughts on public funding? Dr. Good?
Well, the funding concept that's proposed in the governor's biennial budget for Ohio was articulated as one that would allow the dollars to follow the students, leading some constituents to believe that a free, appropriate public education for each child has a base dollar value, which then is supplemented by add-ons depending upon the demographies associated with each of those learners. For example, disability or economic disadvantage or giftedness and so on. There are some positives of this, such a model that assigns dollars to children. The sum can be adjusted then to accommodate for the conditions such as poverty or exceptionality or language proficiency. But it does concern me that we think for even a minute that you could have one value that is going to address the intervention needs for every learner with that same attribute or that same confounding variable. For example, I may be English limited, but I may be an emergent learner, whereas you're much more progressed. And so we require different kinds of interventions. I think too that when the dollars follow the child, it flies in the face of having aligned systems. For our system, which is the 11th largest in the state, it's important that we can aggregate the dollars that follow the children so that we can get economies of scale. If you are the only limited English proficient learner in your classroom and you have $1,500 that comes with you to the teacher, but you're an emergent learner, you're probably going to need $22,000 worth of intervention, and all that teacher's been given is $1,500. However, if I can aggregate 15 learners together, then I have the $22,500 to buy the resources and the paraprofessionals to support all of those learners no matter where they are in the district, and you would receive those services then. So being able to align and realize those economies of scale is something that may not be possible if the dollars go directly to the classroom, directly to the building in this new dollar follow the child system.
Well, the dollar following the child system has remarkable satisfaction to people. It feels good, it tastes good, they really like it. They make, in my mind, the mistake of thinking that that is an appropriate model. And the problem is we don't actually pay attention to that partnership I was talking about, the Great American Partnership of Public Education. The dollar following the child is a market-based approach. It doesn't take into account the need for unified and aligned services. It doesn't take into account the need for communities to come together around education. If you don't have communities coming together around education, what do you have? You've got a bunch of splinters and fragments here and there and everywhere, and no overwhelming drive and desire to be a community together.
Well, that's when I listened to you speak earlier this afternoon, and you talked about the community. I think one of the things we are not facing is we've transformed our schools from community-based schools to government-based schools.
Yes, we have.
And governments are inherently bureaucracies, and the only solutions they know are bureaucratic solutions. And you get a guy from Microsoft colluding with a technocrat from Washington, and you wind up with a real bureaucratic nightmare, but they think it's a solution. And they really believe it. I mean, they're well-meaning people, but they're doing some very dangerous stuff to the quality of life in our schools and to little children. And we don't, I mean, I watch my own grandson. It scares me to death what I see happening in his school. And the teachers mean well. But they say, we've got to cover the material because they're going to be on the test. Well, that's fine. They don't get the kids to come along. So the teacher's covering the material, but the kid still doesn't. And then the teacher gets punished because my grandson won't sit on the mat right or whatever it is.
So, Dr. Good, in terms of the actual funding model, do you have any thoughts on what an appropriate funding model might be? Now, granted, the states have attempted to solve that several times over the last several years, but any thoughts on that? Not that you're going to solve the world's problems or the state's problems right now, but what are your thoughts on funding?
If I had the answer to that, Scott, I probably would be tapped for a different position in the industry. I do not have the answer for that. I would welcome my colleagues' perspectives. Did
Nice
you
way
give
to
this to
toss
me
that,
so I
Dave.
can sing because of my voice?
Exactly, yes.
Let me, I can't answer the question, but I can suggest one other thing we need to think about. We've commoditized education to the point that we think all schooling is about is the individual child. Schools are about communities.
Right.
And we've got to understand that schools are the heart, if they're if they're functioning well, they are a community property. And the education of children is not just the property of the parent. You know, I had a parent call me here some time back, and I'm a grandparent, but I'm not a parent. And she started talking about she was tired of paying her taxes to educate these kids when she could take her tax money and she could take it. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll give you mine if you give me yours. I said, because I pay a lot more taxes than you do. I'll guarantee you, I know I do. And it's for education of your children. But I got no children in school. And that's where we're coming is senior citizens are going to begin to say, hey, why should I pay for the tuition of a child? There's a difference between paying for the cost of schooling and paying tuition. When you start transforming it into tuition that I can carry with me any place, whether it's a voucher or whatever, all at once I see it differently. It's like food stamps. You know, everybody, there's no one in our society, I believe, wants people to starve. But the minute you make the instrument of non-starvation food stamps, you can, well, they take those food stamps and buy cigarettes with them.
Yeah, you're right. And we've seen it here in Westerville. You hear it in other communities. You hear it everywhere, no matter what town, what city, what district you're in. The idea about, well, I don't have kids in school, so why should I be bothering with this? You should be bothering with this because this is everyone's life. And we're losing that. And it's so frustrating to me. And sometimes I lay awake at night and I think about what we have lost and what is the message? How do we get it back? How do we keep what is worth keeping and lose what we have to lose?
So what is your wish for that then?
Oh,
You know,
good heavens.
Where do we go from here in terms of if we've lost, now, you know, where do we move forward? If we're in an implementation dip, okay, how do we move forward? What would be your one wish for public education?
One wish.
Just one.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Now you didn't tell me I had to only have one wish for public education, and I think I wouldn't even use the term wish. I would use the term yearning. My yearning for public education is that we can create that synergy across the communities, across parents, non-parents, corporations, educators, children, so that we can create that synergy, so that we begin to move in an effort that isn't so riddled with blame and isn't so riddled with shallowness. A shallow, appropriate means of education is no education at all. We live in a soundbite world, and that's what we have diminished so much of education to be. And in doing that, we've lost not only its larger purpose, we've lost its joy. And that's what we're missing. And how do we come back to that? We don't come back to it with additional standards. We don't come back to it with online assessments. We don't come back to it with rules and regulations and processes and procedures and god-awful consequences, even though we know those are here and we know we have to deal with them. What we have to come back to them with is within each heart of the individuals that we're working with. We have to be able to speak up. We have to be able to carry the message. We have to not stand back and let it happen to us as we have.
I think we can learn a lot from the mega churches.
Yeah, good point.
If we, you know, you got an audience out here, people, I suspect they don't get together very often.
Actually, at board meetings lately.
But if you had small groups of, say, 5 to 10 people, and I don't care whether it's this particular conference, but they were organized enough that they could go back to somebody's living room and drink a cup of coffee and talk about what they think they heard and what they think they learned. And you begin to get that community conversation going. So to the point you got a great conversation going on. And you wouldn't have to have, in this community, more than 100 such groups. So the conversation would be widespread because people would be talking about what they're talking about. It takes some time to get that happening. But when people start bumping into each other in the grocery store or whatever grocery store you have, and they start bumping into their own church, and all at once you begin to find that dynamic. And it seems to me that's something schools are going to have to do.
You're right.
It's cause that great conversation.
The work of Jamie Vollmer actually
Absolutely, that's exactly what
epitomizes
he's
that,
talking
yes.
about.
So Dr. Good, a wish, other than solving school funding, okay, what do you got?
I do wish for time as well, and we do have a community engagement committee that is doing exactly what you suggested, meeting with all of the staff across the district and then engaging about 86 different organizations outside the school system to not only hear their hopes and their fears for the future, but also to communicate what's relevant in a 21st century education. They're also meeting with student groups, by the way, and I think that adds a new perspective, a perspective that I don't want to lose. I don't know how many people in the room had the privilege of hearing Rachel Jackson and J.D. Coffey speak at the panel that was held at Otterbein earlier this year. But something that Rachel shared in her remarks has resonated with me since then. And she said that we seem so focused on the cognitive development of the individual. What about our spiritual development? What about our souls? Who's minding the balance in our lives? And that concerns me. It is a tripod. It is the body, the mind, and the soul. And our generation had the benefit, oftentimes, of dogma that were observed in whatever religious affiliations we may have had. That isn't something that's germane or inherent necessarily in our students' generation. And so, in many ways, there's a void there. And they're looking for some guidance, some counsel in how do we prioritize and what is moral in our lives, and a sounding board for that. I'm not suggesting we add that on to the plate, the already too full plate of our teachers, but I think we need to be mindful that there are two components of a child's development, and that is their emotional and their physical selves that are far lagging behind the cognitive development we seem so focused on now.
I'm going to let that be the last word because I think that was a tremendous final statement for our group today. So thank you all for coming today and challenging us a little bit in our thinking. Thank you.
Just in time. Thank you, Dr. Klein. Heather Kearns. Heather, could you please stand?